Peace be upon you, and welcome to Way Stations. My name is Rehan Khan, and this is the podcast where we talk about what does it mean to be human in the modern age. And I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Dr. Walead Mosaad. Dr. Walead, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How have you been doing?
Very well, very well. We've both been away on travels, but it's good to be back.
Yeah, it's always good to be back to your routine, your structure, and but it's nice to get away also, as you know.
Indeed, indeed.
Mm.
Now, today we're going to be speaking about AI and humanity. And when you mention AI or artificial intelligence, it tends to set off a lot of anxiety and uncertainty amongst a lot of people. What does it mean for humanity? How is it this going to impact us? Now, when you look at the topic in itself, and I'm just going to give it a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll go into some more questions. But when you look at the subject in itself, I mean, machines today are smart, they're efficient, they're very good at doing complex, calculations and raw data processing and so on. But there are really two types of artificial intelligence. We have what we call artificial narrow intelligence, or ANI, and sometimes this is called weak AI. Now, right now, all computer and intelligent technologies are really within this domain. They're within artificial narrow intelligence because the machine has a narrow intelligence where it serves a very well-defined purpose. So these machines are trained and they're focused to perform a specific task. So, for example, this could be Apple's Siri, Amazon's Alexa, it could be IBM Watson, it could be an autonomous vehicle, it could be a chatbot in a contact center, it could be a chess-playing algorithm. In other words, it basically does one thing. So, for example, the chatbot in the contact center is not going to suddenly start driving your vehicle, right? So, because it has a specific domain. So it has a narrow intelligence and it stays within a well-defined purpose. And that really is all the AI technology we have today. There's something then which is called artificial general intelligence, AGI, and sometimes this is called strong AI. Now, this is the kind of thing that starts to worry people, starts to scare people. You have things, you look at science fiction films, Terminators, Skynet becoming self-aware, the Matrix films. Now, that type of AGI or strong AI is very, very, according to all the experts, is very, very far out, right? Because we're talking about a machine that would have some kind of human-level consciousness and potentially surpass human intelligence. So right now, that is very much science fiction. So the discussion today is very much about AI in terms of a narrow sense. And what can it do with regards being an intelligent algorithm, being an intelligent asset, and so on. So this is just a general kind of broad introduction into some of the terms around this particular topic before we start to go into some more specifics. So, Dr. Walead, perhaps you can start us off with also some general thoughts you have on the subject of AI and humanity.
Yes, Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Yeah, I can't say that my experience with AI is as extensive as yours or other people. Most of my dealings with AI has been, at least on a personal level, via ChatGPT, which I tend to use on occasion. But looking at it, I think one of the things, at least from, let's say, a Muslim intellectual perspective, traditional perspective, would be defining terms. And I think using that word intelligence for what generally these computer programs are able to do might be a bit of a misnomer. If we look to the traditional definition of intellect or of knowledge, it's actually what makes a human being. And to ascribe that to something that's not human is almost, in a sense, ascribing humanity to something that's not human. And I think the trepidation that you just mentioned and the anxiety and the movies that we've seen and, so sentient, self-aware AI that then seeks to destroy its creator, its humanity, and so forth. I think that's kind of part of it because we feel a little bit worried, if not intrepid, about the idea that this thing that was created by human beings and then can act on its own, but it doesn't have the human soul to kind of temper it or to gear it or to, help it make moral decisions. So I assume you could probably program an AI to appear to act morally, but again, it would be the semblance of morality. It wouldn't be real morality, because this is not a thing that can act on its own in that particular way, because it's not a human being. So I think maybe if I had to identify where the tension is, it would be like this. And obviously, I don't want to turn this podcast into just a bashing of AI. There must be, or I believe there are generally good uses for it. But I think I would like to think about it in the larger trend of things, of how these technologies tend to develop, and then we get to a place where we didn't really consider the implications of it and the ramifications of it and the effect that would have on societies. So, like, case in point, the mobile phone. Obviously, the mobile phone is very useful, and basically you're carrying around a supercomputer that in the 1960s and 70s would need several floors of an office building. But there are implications for that, right? There's consequences also that has led to, I would say, this diminishing aspect of our humanity, and I think AI is a culmination of that. That really, if we were to ask ourselves, what does it mean to think anymore, or to be creative, or to draw sets of ideas together and come up with new knowledge? So I think if I had to choose one of the dangers of AI, it would be something like that, encroaching on that particular aspect, that people may become so dependent upon it that they don't even know where to start or how to go about thinking about something or solving a problem independent of an AI. And then maybe we'll get into discussion later about transhumanism and the singularity, and how there's going to be a merging of humanity and computer. And again, there's a philosophy behind that, so Cartesian duality that basically divided man into machine and a body part, and then the physical part, and then you have the soulful part. That's part of the reason where I think from our perspective we wouldn't look at humanity like that. That we're not machines. We don't have a mechanical or a purely mechanical aspect to us, because the two cannot be separated. Your physical movements and abilities and so forth, and let's call it, for lack of a better word, the mechanics of your physicality, right? Even though it appears like that, and some people would study in this way, from our perspective, or I would say a traditional perspective, it doesn't really work that way, and you cannot divorce one from the other, and that means you can't, affect a part of the physicality without accepting, also affecting something of the emotional aspect and the mental aspect, and let alone the spiritual aspect. So just looking at AI as a pure tool that has nothing to do with spirituality or emotions or mental acuity or things like that, I think that would be a big mistake. I think going into using AI, we should have our eyes wide open and be very clear about its implications, and that any sort of technology will have implications upon your moral and spiritual being. And that should be a given moving forward. And I think Muslims have the opportunity to lead the discussion on this particular point, because I think we do have an articulate way of looking at it and thinking about it. So, I mean, that's kind of my initial thoughts about it. It's a huge subject, but I would be interested to hear maybe something that you can fill in the blanks for me. There is kind of a lot of hype about AI, what it can do, and the promises that it has, and that it will be limiting these jobs and this thing that it will be doing. But how much of that hype is real, and how much of that is kind of conjecture and maybe wishful thinking?
Yeah, it's a valid point. And before I get onto that, I think something that you just mentioned there, the late NYU professor Neil Postman, he basically, and he's one of his most famous books was Amusing Ourselves to Death. He basically said that when a new technology is invented, there are two questions we should ask ourselves. Number one, what problem does this solve? Right? And number two, what problems will it create? Right? I think that's a really interesting criteria. Yeah. So, for example, something like, TikTok, or like, what problem is it solving? Well, I'm not really sure it is, but anyway. And then what problems they're creating? Well, there's potentially quite a few there. So I think that's for me, that's always a good measure. When I look at, should I introduce a technology into my life? That's a question I always ask myself. What problem is it solving? If it's not, then I'm not going to use it. But now getting to your question about the technology enthusiasts and the hype that's being created by Silicon Valley. Well, we see that in the press, in the media. Every time you open any kind of media, there's always some hype about AI. But when you look beyond the hype and you look at people who've been in the field for a very long time, you've got quite a few critics. I mean, the NYU professor Gary Marcus, who's a real, very steeped in this whole area. He talks very clearly about the learning limitations that are evident in AI, and AI very much hitting a wall, i.e. it does computation, but it's not really going to where the proponents of AI are talking about in terms of intelligence. You've got people like the professor of complexity, Melanie Mitchell, who talks about really that the present-day AI systems and their limitations that they have. And they have, these are clunky systems that have a lot of limitations. And then you've obviously got questions of, material questions of bias and fairness and security vulnerabilities and legal liability and urgent ethical gaps. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can't just ignore in the hype. Now, from a business perspective, if you're a small business owner, it kind of works quite well. It can be almost like an assistant to you. It can help you with doing stuff. If you're a large corporation, then investing in what's called a large language model or a foundation model, costs a lot of money, and it's very not many can afford it. And so you have things like small language models coming up. But without getting too technical, there are, from a business perspective, I think what we have to look at is that what business problem is the technology solving? What's it going to enable you to do? But what I would push back on is a lot of the bold predictions that are made. Even if I just pick up the press from, say, a year ago, in 2024, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, he made a bold prediction. He said that, we believe that in 2025, we may see the first AI agents, right? So this is called agentic AI. We see the first AI agents join the workforce and materially change the output of companies, okay? And then soon after, OpenAI's chief product officer, said some similar stuff as well. And the fact that, ChatGPT is going to start to do real things for you in the real world and so on. Now, none of this has happened, right? So that was a bold statement that in 2025, we're going to have AI agents, materially changing the output of companies. Hasn't happened, right? And you go back and you look at a lot of the claims that have come out from primarily Silicon Valley. Did it happen? Well, no, it didn't. And I think they're over predicting the future. And that's partly because they're trying to create markets for themselves to sell stuff, right? So you hype a market and then you try and sell stuff and then, you hype the market and there's kind of that hype cycle constantly running. And that's very much how a lot of the modern day financial markets work anyway. But having said all that, AI as a tool is really, really helpful, but you have to think about it from the perspective of how is this going to amplify and improve the work I do. So I'll take a really easy example that hopefully all of us can relate to. If you look at architects back in the 1970s, 80s, and to some extent 90s, architects would design buildings, vertically high buildings, 50 stories high and so on, that were all straight lines, right? Because every time there was a change, the building would have to be redrafted, rebalanced, redrawn and so on, all done by hand. But then computer-aided design comes in, CAD. Now, with CAD, what you could do is you could just change the shape of a building and the computer would recalculate the loads, the balances, the forces, the materials required, and it saved the architects an incredible amount of redrafting time. Did computer-aided design get rid of architects? No. But it was a tool that amplified what architects did. And so AI very much for me is not about the hype that we're getting from Silicon Valley. It's really, well, in my job as a professor or as a writer, as an educator, as someone in marketing, how can it amplify something that I'm already doing? And that's the way I guess I would look at it. But one thing that I think we do see a lot of these AI companies really pursuing is a quest for data, right? Everyone seems to be, data is a new kind of gold, or data is a new oil, or whatever you want to call it. And this desire to almost understand human beings as some sort of machine, okay, where we are generating data and then we become part of a data flow in itself. I'd like to really ask you, what your thoughts are about this, because there's a drive to collect data, and there's a sense that, well, humans are just like a machine. We're generating data. We collect this data. We understand people. I'd just like to get your thoughts on that.
That's an interesting question, Rehan. I thought about it a little bit, and I think, what's data except trying to group things that are similar or alike under certain, let's say, categories, and try to look for patterns within that. And then the question has to become, well, why are you looking for the pattern? What are you trying to do? And maybe perhaps it's obvious if we're talking about a business or some type of marketing scheme where you want to appeal to the person that you're marketing to so that they can buy your product or your goods or your services. And so you can't obviously do that so easily. Before, people would look at demographics, and they would say, people living in the northeastern United States of this particular income category in this particular neighborhood tend to buy these things or be interested in these sorts of things. And then you would have TV commercials and the like, appealing to kind of that broad or maybe narrow demographic, depending upon how much they want to focus on that particular group. But what appears to me today is that you don't even have the need to look at broad categories anymore. You're actually looking at the individual. And I think this is why we have huge heaps and amounts of data that have to be sifted through and understood. And so literally our presence on the internet leaves footprints and leaves tracks, as you're well aware. And so all of that leaves behind a trail for whoever's looking for it in terms of data. And you can put on your Apple phone, ask app not to track and that sort of thing. But I think we all know that doesn't really work that well, and you are being tracked, and perhaps not by your personal identity. I'm not sure how far it's gone, but at least you're a number, and your preferences and the things that you scroll through and the things that you click on and all these sorts of things, all these keystrokes are literally being recorded. And obviously, I think AI is a big part of that in trying to sift through all this data. And I think it's not even humanly possible to look at how many keystrokes are hit a day over the world. Billions, I would assume. If we have billions of people, then typing and scrolling and clicking, and so all of that is being studied and all of that is being analyzed. But to what end? I think you raised the question in the beginning with Neil Postman, like, what good is this technology going to bring us, and then what sort of detriments are there? What are the dangers of this technology? And I think there has to be clear values and rules, and short of AI collapsing and just not working, I think we have to assume it's here to stay and it's not going anywhere. And if that's the case, then we have to look about how are we going to deal with it? What are some of the rules, or what are some of the ethical guidelines and principles, at least we as people are interested in that, what should we set for ourselves even if society doesn't go that way. And you mentioned Sam Altman, and I think in the beginning they had kind of a more ethical approach and they weren't going to do anything that was kind of on the racy side, but now they're opening that up from what I understand. And so you can actually have a chat GPT that's going to talk in pornographic way to you if that's what you're interested in. So again, the technology being used to what ends? What's the objective? What's the guideline behind it? And I think that's really where I think we should make our voices known. And short of this thing completely collapsing, which doesn't look likely, or being replaced by something even more powerful, you never know. But I think if things are just left as they are, and you let it just progress, let's say, to its logical conclusion, then I don't think it's a good end. And I do think that something dystopian is going to come out of this. And notwithstanding the benefits that obviously that one can have, and it does have the ability to make these computations at a rate that no human being could possibly do, and it is a good time saver. But now we have instances of people, not using it as a tool, but as a replacement. This ChatGPT. Imagine you have this thing that seems and acts and talks like a person, and maybe you can attach a voice to it now, and it could talk to you, and you can tell it how you're feeling, and then may give you a response. And then I've seen in the news that some unfortunately young men and women use this thing to commit, not use it to commit suicide, but obviously they use it as a therapist, and the result was their death for whatever happened with the interaction with the ChatGPT or the AI. So those are things that are very concerning. That it's just too easy to use it as a replacement, though it's meant to be a tool.
Yeah. So can I just pick something up on as you're talking here, because you mentioned earlier about Cartesian and you mentioned Descartes, and I was just wondering if you could maybe just unpack that for the listeners a little bit, because Descartes is one of the philosophers who has a very significant impact on modernity without perhaps many of us not realizing that. Could you just go into that a little bit more? And you said Cartesian duality and denaturing of humanity from its soul. Maybe just unpack that a bit, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, basically, Descartes was quote unquote one of the Enlightenment thinkers, which before, let's say, pre-modern people, there was a set of I would say universal principles or assumptions that most people live by, whether they were in Europe or they were in the Muslim countries. Generally, differences, of course, but let's say call it a traditional perspective. And those were very theocentric societies. It revolved around the belief in God, whether you're in Christian Europe or you're in Muslim Southern Hemisphere or other parts of the world. And it made the idea that this, that which you perceive and that which is of the, what Descartes was looking at as, res extensa, or the extended substance, that which is, there's a reality that's real, right? That you can perceive. And then you have your very ability to perceive that, which is your intellect, which is the thinking substance, or the res cogitans that Descartes was talking about. So traditional people didn't make this bifurcation. They didn't see this duality. And it was a stated fact that things have a reality to them. Sometimes you can perceive them, sometimes we can, sometimes we can perceive them to a greater extent, and so forth. But Descartes extended this, and what's referred to as the mind-body problem, that human beings are a union of these two things. So you can have something that's going on in your head that you may think is a reflection of reality, and then that reality is not that, but it's very real to you. And maybe in his time, it didn't take off like it took off later, maybe in our time, which later led to, Derrida's deconstructionism, and I don't want to go into a whole Western philosophy thing, but you get to the point where I think we live now, where people make reality as they see it. They define reality. Not reality is to be discovered, but reality is to be defined by whoever. And that was the assumption I'm referring to in pre-modern people, that reality was something to be discovered, that we are learning about how things are, not making things the way that we want them to be. And I think it was Heidegger that said, pre-modern man would say, know thyself. And postmodern man would say, be thyself. And I mention this because this is the underlying principle and philosophy by which all of this is coming from. The very idea of thinking about transhumanism and merging of the AI with the human being, and we can make it as we like, and all that sort of thing. If that's your guiding principle, then there is no kind of awe or being enamored or seeing the sublime in the world. The world then becomes this kind of dead substance that's not alive, that can be manipulated, that can be changed, that can be made into whatever you want to make it. And unfortunately, I think this is the prevailing philosophy that guides most people, though they may not be aware of it. And even religious-minded people have you. You could have studied religion in a particular way or inherited from your family and your parents, but you never really got to the nitty-gritty of the metaphysics that powers your religion, right? And this is true of Catholicism, most certainly, and certainly true of Islam, and certainly true of traditional Judaism, that, you know, this reality that we're living is something we need to, it's sublime, and we can discover and we can learn about it. And, you know, science, before it was called science, was called natural philosophy. So if you were a natural philosopher, you studied how things work, you know, whether it was the cosmos or, you know, or what's on Earth. And then you saw that there was this kind of, you know, reciprocal nature between the two things. You know, as is above is below. And they talked about the microcosm and the macrocosm. You know, that the macrocosm is the greater cosmos and the microcosm is human being. The Sheikh Ibn Arabi, he flipped that. He said, no, you're the macrocosm. You're the real thing. And then everything else is a reflection of what's going on in the human being. And the rest of it is the microcosm and so forth. So these kind of metaphysical principles, I think, have all been lost and don't guide the thinking of most people. So as a result, we get this almost Machiavellian approach that didn't begin with Descartes. Obviously, it began with that, and it doesn't end with him, but he kind of set the wheels in motion for the idea of, you know, we can manipulate reality because we have this duality within us that we can't quite reconcile. You know, and everybody knows his famous quote, "I think, therefore I am," and that sort of thing. Like he flipped the narrative, right? Because in philosophy, there's three basic things you study, or branches of knowledge: ontology, which is the science of being, and epistemology, of how do we know what we know, and ethics. And so ontology always has to precede that, you know, the science of being, because being was a corollary. You are. It's not something to be questioned. But Descartes flipped that. So he's like, how do I know I am? He's like, I think, therefore I am. So he took the epistemology first. So he questioned everything. He questioned the idea that you even exist, and what is this that we're living? And so when everything is up to question and everything can be doubted, then everything then can be manipulated. And then nothing has meaning anymore, and it's just the way that I want to see it and the way that I want it to be. And as a result, if you know, I've listened to a little bit of what these guys are saying, you know, the big tech guys, and they sound, you know, we've seen the mad scientist movies, and they have a little bit of that in their rhetoric about the things that they want to do and the things that they think, you know, how they want things to happen. And you mentioned a quote of Sam Altman that you'll have some AI robot sitting next to you at your desk and working with you and this sort of thing. And, you know, that's kind of the thinking that they have. Like, let's just make it the way that we think it should go. And obviously this also ties into the notion of progress, and that as we, you know, as we go through and accede in time, then things will naturally get better, and technology is going to be the underpinning of that. And, you know, not necessarily, you know, go ask the victims of two very costly and deadly world wars and countless other wars that are happening all over the world right now. And so, you know, the promise of that doesn't look as promising as I think as people once assumed. But I mean, we've talked a little bit about kind of, you know, maybe some of the detriments and some of the difficulties and some of the perhaps dystopian aspects of this. But if we're to look at what people are talking about, this kind of idea of singularity, or what you mentioned, artificial general intelligence, doesn't happen. What about the narrow intelligence? You know, are there kind of uses for the AI that are in a narrow purview that perhaps we should think about, or are good to use, or can be developed further? I was interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think we definitely can talk a little bit about artificial narrow intelligence and maybe get onto that. I would like just to come back, though, to you a little bit around this kind of data-led view with regards how people are talking about merging human and machine intelligence to create something bigger, right? And I think if you look at the discussion with a lot of the intellectual political elites in the tech circles over the last decade or so, they're all speaking about some kind of self-improving AI that's going to lead to this kind of intelligence explosion, which they call the singularity, which they say, oh, it's going to come around 2045 or 2050. Now, the proponents of this view, they kind of conveniently assume that the human being can be reduced to a sort of biological machine, right? Some kind of biological machine. So they see the brain as very much a computer. And so intelligence is just another computer system, right? So the brain is a computer and intelligence is just another computer system. And this has partly been this kind of popular image of the brain. I think has come about. The philosopher John Searle, he said that because computers are such a foundational part of modern civilization, humans start to explain their worldview with the language of computing, because computers are everywhere. So we just start using computing as a way to explain our worldview, whether it's about, a process, whether it's about someone's brain, whether it's whatever it might be. So I think, this whole approach is very much a technology-led movement. And if you look at the underlying philosophy in the modern period, not when Descartes was around, in the modern period, it is this thing called transhumanism. And it's a belief that technology is going to enhance human beings, that we will move beyond our physical bodies, right? But not into a metaphysical reality, but we're going to move beyond our physical bodies into something else. So what they advocate, there's a couple of things. Number one is that they say that the brain is like software and the body is like hardware. Okay, so it's very much, as I say, Silicon Valley language. The brain is software, the body is hardware. So in effect, you can download the software, the brain, right, into a supercomputer.
Well, I think that's actually very Cartesian, because that was the whole premise of Descartes, that we can't reconcile between this immaterial, non-physical mind and the physical mind, the physical body. To the extent he started doubting, is this my body? Am I in reality? And how do I do that with my mind that is immaterial? So it's like they almost flipped it. Now they're saying that the mind is something that is material and could be downloaded and could be put somewhere else and is not necessarily connected to this particular body. And we've seen that. I was on a flight the other day and I watched Avatar, The Way of Water, the second one.
Right.
And in it, I'm not sure if you remember the story, but there was that evil army guy, and he got killed in the first one.
Right.
And then now he comes back to life because before he died, they downloaded all of his consciousness and memory and so forth into a computer. And then they put him in the Navi, the blue avatar.
Okay.
And so he comes back to life in that thing and carries all of the memories. But the movie, interesting enough, it was quick to point out at several points, like, I'm not that person.
Right.
But he had a son from the previous movie who was just an infant, and now he's like a teenager.
Right.
But part of the script is that he still sees this boy as his son, even though technically it's not his son because it's a clone. They're not the same person. But yeah, anyway, I mean that's a very Cartesian thing, to look at software and hardware.
Yeah. Well, that's I think the crux of what these guys are talking about. They're talking, I say, that's the transhumanist philosophy, right? Brain is the software and the body is the hardware. Now, I think if you look at this also, there is a certain ambivalence, there's a certain contradiction in the way they advocate this, because they say if you download yourself into a singularity, right, into this super intelligence, okay, if you do that, you're going to lose all notion of yourself as an individual, because you are now a mass. To me, when I used to watch Star Trek with Captain Jean-Luc Picard in the 80s and 90s, one of their villains was the Borg collective, right? Resistance is futile or something like that. It sounds like the Borg to me, right? Basically, that's what you're doing. You're downloading yourself into this thing, and your sense of and being an individual, i.e., your rights, your responsibilities, your accountability, null and void. Okay. So I think what's happening is that this agenda is being pushed really hard by some people, primarily from Silicon Valley, but elsewhere as well. There is something called the singularity movement, but a lot of people around the world who come from a faith tradition would question this, and they say, well, no, the mind is not software and the body is not hardware. Rather, we have a body. When it decays, the soul transcends back to the creator. Okay. And so you can't just identify intelligence as brain activity. Okay. And I think the last thing I'd just say here is that I think a lot of the people who are kind of pursuing this agenda of singularity, what's really driving them is a desire to live forever. Yeah. They are seeking this sort of immortality through the singularity. That's why you can see all these tech companies are involved in life extension projects, right? Life extension projects, they want to live forever, right? So it's a very deep rooted, old, feeling that many humans have had. They don't want to die. So they don't want to die. So they'd rather get uploaded and amalgamated into the singularity and then live on forever. So I think that's driving that. I think just to come back to you, we can maybe talk about artificial narrow intelligence in just a moment. But I'd just like to ask you something. I know this sounds quite kind of bleak and it sounds quite kind of dystopian. How would you kind of frame this discussion from a faith-based perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to comment on what you just said about people just wanting to live forever. And it brought to mind a verse from the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah that you will find these people, أحرص الناس على حياة, that they are the ones who cling most closely to their life. And from those who associate partners with God, one of them would wish that they would live 1,000 years.
Right.
And so I think if you're not grounded in faith, whatever faith tradition that would be, and obviously as Muslims we believe that Islam is that faith tradition, but whatever faith tradition that one may have, I don't think if you're grounded in that, it's kind of like there's no guardrails. Anything can happen, anything can go, and then it just becomes the individual ambition. I think is anything. If there's a limiting factor, then that would be it. And as far as your ambition can go, then that's how these things will go. And I think we're seeing that. And if I had to evaluate from a faith-based perspective, I mean, I don't want to take it to the apocalyptic sort of end game, but you have to wonder that all of these series of things that are happening now, because one of the things that we believe about the apocalypse and we believe about the Antichrist or Dajjal and Masih ad-Dajjal is that he is going to be able to manipulate and influence many, many people all at once, large swaths of people, and he won't need that much time to do it. Some of the hadith indicate that this could happen in a matter of days or of months. And days and years will be different then, but if you calculate it, it's not a long time, maybe a year and a half, something like this of our time. And you have to wonder, well, how does one do that? How will they be able to do that? And we're talking about, let's say, if humanity's in the billions still by then, how does he's able to do that? And I think we're kind of seeing the possibility of that now. Now with this idea that we're just data points, and that we, to the degree that's people may think even our lives are very deterministic, because the data seems to tell the story, and that you're going to make this decision in life and you're going to live this particular way. And these predictive models, as they are, right, is what they call them, seem to be more often correct than wrong. Then people may get the impression that they themselves are almost equated to God. And I think that's the Dajjalic drive, right? That what was normally the realm of the divine, now you want to be in that. And that has been the folly of humanity and every demagogue since time immemorial. Pharaoh was like this, and he said, even the Quran mentions, he said to his people, I am your Lord Most High. And so we may not people having come out and saying, I'm God, but they're saying things that, like, we're going to have all these things happening and these transhumanistic things, and we're going to download people's things and so forth. It's very akin to that, I think, very similar. So, I'll take it back to the beginning of the discussion. And I think as a faith-based person, you have to think, right, and evaluate and consider and use all of the faculties at your disposal, right, which is your intellectual cognition and your spiritual cognition, to really see things as they are. And one of the things about that the Dajjal will be able to do, he's going to manipulate all of these people. But interestingly enough, the ones who will not be affected by him are the ones who have that spiritual cognition, not an intellectual one. So the hadith does mention, that disbeliever or disbelief is written on his forehead. We could interpret that literally, but if we did interpret literally, then why didn't all the other followers see that written? So it can't be just something as simple as it's written on his forehead and everybody can see it. It has to be maybe something more of a spiritual tint, a spiritual inclination. So that means if you have that spiritual cognition, then you will see it clearly, right? And I think this is, from a faith-based perspective, this is what I think people need to tap into. That, if you're a person who believes in God and believes in the Creator and believes in, as you mentioned, that, these bodies are an amana, they're a trust, it's something we've been given to use for our time on earth, but it's not the end of the story for us. It's actually just the very, very beginning of the story. And the true beginning of the story will be after we leave these bodies. And if you believe in that, and you believe in consequences, and you believe in a day of reckoning, then you have to consider all the things that are thrown at us and all the things we're asked to use and to partake in, and look at the consequences of them and live as an ethical, moral human being, and make your decisions based upon that. So I don't want to paint it as a dystopian thing. There's always going to be a push and pull. There's always going to be, those who, push the side of a human-centered narrative, and those who push the side of a God-centered narrative. And that's always happened. And that will be the case in our belief system to the last day. It's always going to be like that. So I think it's just a choice of where do you want to stand with that? Where do you want to sit? Which side of the fence are you going to be on? And I think you have to have a healthy amount of resistance to all of these things. And that's where our thinking comes in. We don't just take things because, well, everyone is doing it and that's a thing. And they're saying it's going to be great for us and it's going to be more productive and it's going to be more this and that. Maybe. I'm not denying that that's not a possibility, but also look at the consequences of it and think about it and consider it. And, don't just use your intellectual abilities, use your spiritual abilities to discern ultimately truth from falsehood as we believe it is. So,
yeah. Okay. So just to pick up on something there, which you said, which was the fact that, this Antichrist Dajjal will be able to communicate with everyone very quickly. I guess, since the industrial era, one thing that has quickened has been communications, right? Whether it was through the telegraph, carrier pigeons, to telegraph, to railroads, to aircraft, to, copper cables, to optic fiber cables, to big data centers, to satellite systems. Everything is about efficiency and speed and getting it out there. So in many ways, if one were to take a very apocalyptic view, you could say that all the infrastructure is being put in place around the world to enable that to happen. So, but of course, there are advantages for this infrastructure. Like we're having this conversation right now, it wouldn't happen without the infrastructure. But the infrastructure does seem to be being trenched in around the world and under the oceans. Obviously, all the submarine cables that are around the world that carry all 96% of the world's data traffic are all down there. Let me maybe just cover off this thing about artificial narrow intelligence, which you asked me earlier. I think this is something which is with regards what AI is today. And like, any technology is a double-edged sword, right? The internet is very convenient for us, but it also, all the research shows, it shortened our attention span, right? So there's always a downside to every kind of technology. Yeah. I think one of the things that we see today is the fact that some AI systems seem to know us better than we know ourselves because of the amount of data that we're giving them. I think for those of you who haven't watched it, there was a documentary in 2020 called The Social Dilemma, which really illustrates how AI personalization is creating this mass manipulation of people. And one of the people who was featured on that was a guy called Tristan Harris. I remember him saying on the program that, when you click on your smartphone, what you don't realize is that on the other end, there are billions of dollars of supercomputing power that are trained on you to make you click again, right? Yeah, because you're clicking, you think you're clicking, but on the other end, they've got these very powerful computers that are creating compelling reasons for you to keep on click, 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 click. And essentially it's an addiction. And so it's a vicious cycle for you as a user, but it's a virtuous cycle for the big tech companies, because the more you click, it's a money printing machine, right? They generate money through advertising. If you look at the balance sheet of all these big tech companies, most of them, not all of them, 90% plus of the revenue is from advertising. So the more you click, the more you stay. It's a virtuous cycle for them. It's a vicious cycle for you. It doesn't make you happy. Downs your mood, creates mental health problems, and so on. And it's very much driven by something in the tech space they call an objective function. So the objective function of an algorithm is to achieve one thing. It might be to keep you on the site for as long as possible. It might be to click something, but that's the objective function. The objective function is not, oh, we should make your life better. No, the objective function is keep you on the site, which is why sometimes people open up their phone. I'm going to be here for 5 minutes, and then an hour later, they're still on YouTube, right? Because the objective function is to keep you there. And so some people speak about the fact that when we do go onto our devices, we should not look at time spent, but we should look at time well spent, right? How are we spending our time? What are we doing with it? So anyways, there's definitely a few things more to explore there. And I think maybe, we could even do another program on this whole topic later on. But I just want to come back to you, Dr. Williams. Is there any other kind of comments that you've got that you'd like to add in before we go to a close?
Well, I think it's a huge topic, and I think we branched into other things that how we got to this point and what's driving it and so forth. And I think that's interesting, and maybe it would be worthwhile to look at other aspects of this. And we did, I think, speak about time and usage of time, but I think even having an ethos about technology in general, and when new technology is introduced, like you mentioned earlier, what am I going to get from this? What are the detriments? That sort of thing. And I think that's important, especially for young people moving forward. And, we have a generation now that's a generation younger than us that has known nothing else except these portable supercomputers that they carry around with them. And as you said, you're not in isolation. Every time you click on something, there's all this production and computer power and money geared towards you staying on there, right? And we talked about the idea of the attention economy and vying for your attention. And if we are, have a limited scope on this earth, in other words, we're only going to live so many years, then it does become pretty important what you lend your attention to. So I think that's another avenue that we could further explore, I think, in the future, inshallah.
Yeah, no, great. Okay, well, one last question to you then. In light of what we've been talking about with regards to AI, humanity, these topics, is there a book that you could recommend for the listeners?
There was a book I read many, many years ago that actually I refer to back every so often. William Chittick, who's I think still is a professor at SUNY Buffalo in the United States. Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul. And I think it does a very good job of grounding people in, how do I think about myself? How do I think about the universe? And especially this idea of science. And he talks a little bit about the Muslim intellectual tradition. He talks about transmitted knowledge versus intellectual knowledge, that there are things that are transmitted to you that you can, take as true knowledge because of the nature of the transmission. And then there are things that you have to verify on your own, that you figure out on your own. And I think that's an important aspect of the Islamic intellectual tradition, or any intellectual tradition, because we're kind of outsourcing that now. I've taught a few courses, and I've caught people using AI in their essays, and it's too tempting, I think. It's too easy. And if you're pressed for time and all the time commitments that people have, and just to prompt the thing to write something for you, does become, you need a good level of resistance to do that. So again, I go back to the ethical and moral dilemma that we may have with some of these things. But to proceed all of that, you need a very good grounding in really the nature of reality. Because as we said earlier, this is going back to maybe a different sense of what reality is, and in the idea that it can be manipulated and deconstructed and then put back together again in a manner that doesn't resemble the reality that you and me think we're living in. So I think that's a good book to reference in that regard. What about yourself? Anything that you would recommend?
Yeah, I would recommend the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this is one of the very first recorded books available. It's in cruciform script and it's translated a few hundred years ago. And why would I recommend this? Because earlier we were talking about transhumanism, and we said that there's this urge to live forever, for these transhumanists. Now, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh is this king in Ur, in Sumer, in modern day Iraq. And he's a horrible king at the beginning of the story, and then he becomes magnanimous towards the end of the story. But he has a desire to live forever. He doesn't want to die, right? And he seeks out in the story a man called Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim in the book is referred to as the man who survived the flood. So Utnapishtim is the man who survived the flood, and he's said to have lived for 1,000 years. Now, whether that's referring to Prophet Noah, not sure. People aren't sure. You could make a good guess, probably. Anyway, Gilgamesh eventually tracks down Utnapishtim and says to him, what's the secret? Like, how can I live forever? And Utnapishtim says to him, do you know what? It's not worth it. It's really not worth it. and then he goes on to counsel him and says, look, when God created life, he also created death, and you just have to accept that. And so very much wizened, Gilgamesh goes back and becomes a king who lives and a monarch who lives in the moment with his people. So I think it's a good book to remind ourselves that this whole notion of living forever and life extension projects, it's not something new. It's been around for thousands of years as well.
Interesting.
All right. Great. So, Dr. Lee, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to speak to you. And thank you so much to all of our listeners for listening. Please do continue to subscribe. Please do continue to share. And please do, if you have a moment, just leave a rating or a review. It definitely helps the show. And until next time, peace be upon you.